Flashing red lights reflecting off wet asphalt signaled impending disaster. Panic usually grips ordinary citizens during a midnight traffic stop, but Sarah knew her rights. Two arrogant patrolmen approached, smirking, expecting an easy target. They saw a black woman driving an expensive luxury sedan and immediately assumed criminality. Laughter echoed through chilly night air as handcuffs clicked shut. Insults flew, derogatory remarks pierced her calm demeanor. However, those officers made one catastrophic mistake. They allowed her a single phone call. What happened next destroyed careers, shattered egos, and delivered brutal, swift justice nobody saw coming. Karma never misses. The fog had just begun to roll in off the coast of Monterey Bay, casting long, eerie shadows across the damp pavement of the Pacific Coast Highway. It was past midnight on a Tuesday, a time when the wealthy enclave of Ocean View Drive usually slept in absolute undisturbed silence. Sarah Hastings was exhausted. At 38, she had built a reputation that commanded respect in federal courtrooms across the nation. As the lead prosecutor for the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, she spent her days dismantling corrupt institutions and holding powerful people accountable. But tonight, she wasn't Prosecutor Hastings. She was just Sarah, a tired woman in an oversized college hoodie and faded gray sweatpants driving home after a grueling 14-hour deposition. Her vehicle, a pristine 2025 Porsche Panamera, hummed quietly as she navigated the winding oceanside roads. It was a gift to herself after winning a landmark Supreme Court case the previous year. She loved the car, not for its status but for its engineering. She kept her speed perfectly aligned with the posted limit, her mind wandering to the hot shower and warm bed, waiting for her just 2 miles away. Suddenly the tranquil silence of the night was shattered. Brilliant red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror, blindingly bright against the coastal fog. A short, aggressive chirp of a police siren demanded immediate compliance. Sarah glanced at her dashboard. She was going exactly 35 miles per hour. Her registration was current. Her taillights were fully functional. There was absolutely no mechanical or legal reason for a traffic stop. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, Sarah activated her turn signal and smoothly pulled the Porsche over onto the wide shoulder of the road, placing the vehicle in park. She killed the engine, rolled down all 4 windows, a habit she had developed years ago to ensure total transparency during police encounters, and placed both hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. She knew the drill, she knew the statistics, and she knew exactly how these encounters could escalate, regardless of a person's innocence. In her side mirror, she watched the doors of the patrol cruiser swing open. 2 officers stepped out. The driver, Officer Gregory Harrison, was a tall, heavily built man with a tight buzz cut and a swagger that practically radiated unearned authority. His partner, Officer Richard Cobb, was leaner, with a sharp, angular face and a nervous energy, his hand already resting far too close to the service weapon on his duty belt. As they approached, Harrison didn't bother using a flashlight to check the perimeter. Instead, he aimed the blinding beam directly into Sarah's face, holding it there far longer than necessary. "Turn the light down, please," Sarah said, her voice steady and calm, betraying none of the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. Harrison scoffed, a wet, condescending sound. He lowered the beam just an inch, letting it illuminate her face and the expensive leather interior of the Porsche. He leaned heavily against her door, invading her personal space, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Harrison barked, his tone devoid of any professional courtesy. "And no sudden movements. Keep your hands where I can see them." "My hands are on the steering wheel," Sarah replied evenly. "My wallet is in my purse on the passenger seat, and my registration is in the glove compartment. I will need to move my hands to retrieve them. Is that acceptable to you, officer?" Harrison exchanged a look with Cobb, who had taken up a position near the rear passenger window, his posture tense and aggressive. "Look at her, Cobb," Harrison sneered, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "She talks like she's reading from a script. You steal this car from your boss, sweetie. Or did you just find the keys lying around in the mansion you clean? Sarah's jaw tightened. She had faced down multi-billion-dollar corporate lawyers and corrupt politicians without flinching, and she was not about to be intimidated by a racist patrolman with a superiority complex. "I am retrieving my documents," Sarah stated firmly, ignoring the blatantly racist provocation. She moved slowly, deliberately, keeping her movements smooth and visible. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her California driver's license, and then leaned over to pop the glove compartment for the registration. She handed the neat stack of papers out the window. Harrison snatched them from her hand, his eyes scanning the name and address. He let out a loud, theatrical bark of laughter. "Ocean View Drive," Harrison read aloud, his voice dripping with disbelief and mockery. He tapped the plastic card against the roof of her car. "You expect me to believe you live on Ocean View Drive? Houses up there start at $10 million. People who look like you don't live in that neighborhood unless they're wearing a maid's uniform." "Run the plates," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the polite veneer. "Run the license. You'll find the vehicle is registered to me at that address. Now, unless you can articulate reasonable suspicion for this traffic stop, I suggest you process my information and let me go home." Cobb leaned in, his face turning red with sudden anger. "Who do you think you're talking to? You don't give the orders here. Step out of the vehicle." "Step out of the vehicle?" Sarah repeated, her eyes locking onto Cobb's. "On what grounds? I have provided my identification. I have not committed a moving violation. You have no probable cause to order me out of my car. The Supreme Court says we can order anyone out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop," Harrison countered, puffing out his chest, clearly enjoying the power trip. "Pennsylvania versus Mims. Look it up sometime. Now pop the door and get out, before we drag you out." Sarah knew Pennsylvania v. Mims intimately. She also knew that arguing constitutional law with two rogue cops on a deserted highway in the middle of the night was a dangerous game. Her physical safety took precedence over winning a roadside debate. She slowly reached for the door handle. "I'm stepping out," she announced clearly. "I am unarmed and I am not a threat." She opened the door and stepped out into the freezing coastal air. Despite wearing only sweatpants and a hoodie, Sarah stood tall, her posture radiating an intense, immovable authority. She was nearly 6 feet tall in her sneakers, and for a brief second Harrison seemed taken aback by her physical presence. But his arrogance quickly swallowed any hesitation. "Stand at the back of the car, hands on the trunk," Harrison ordered. Sarah complied, placing her palms flat against the cold metal of the Porsche. Without warning, Harrison kicked her feet apart much harder than necessary, causing her to stumble slightly. He then proceeded to conduct a rough, invasive pat-down, his hands lingering just a bit too long to be considered professional. "What are you looking for, officer?" Sarah asked, her voice turning to ice. "Because whatever it is, you aren't going to find it. This is an unlawful detainment." "Shut your mouth," Harrison snapped. "Cobb, search the vehicle. Let's see what she's hiding in there." "You do not have my consent to search my vehicle," Sarah stated loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the sound of the crashing ocean waves. "There is no probable cause. You have not observed any contraband, you have not smelled any illegal substances, and I am not under arrest." "Suspicion of grand theft auto," Harrison lied smoothly, grinning at her. "Registration looks fake, address doesn't match the profile. That gives us plenty of reason to take a look." It was a blatant fabrication, a flimsy excuse designed to justify their profiling. Sarah watched in silent fury as Cobb eagerly began tearing through the interior of her pristine car. He opened the center console, tossing her mints and charging cables onto the floorboards. He pulled her expensive leather briefcase from the back seat, unbuckled it, and recklessly dumped its contents onto the hood of the patrol cruiser. Highly sensitive legal documents, deposition transcripts, and case files spilled everywhere. Had Cobb bothered to read the headers on the documents, he would have seen the seal of the State Attorney General's office. He would have seen Sarah's name listed as the chief prosecuting attorney on a multi-million-dollar federal indictment. But Cobb wasn't reading. He was looking for a reason to put her in a cage. "Look at all this paper," Cobb laughed, shining his flashlight over the scattered files. "She's got a whole fake office set up in here. You running a scam, lady? Identity theft?" "Those are confidential legal documents," Sarah warned, her patience completely evaporating. "If you damage them, or if you read them, you are violating attorney-client privilege and federal law. I strongly advise you to stop what you are doing." Harrison grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging painfully into her bicep. "I told you to shut up. You think using big words is going to save you? We know exactly what kind of person you are. You come up into these nice neighborhoods, scoping out houses, driving a car you probably bought with drug money. You're going to jail tonight." He reached to his duty belt and unclasped his handcuffs. The metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet night. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Harrison commanded, pulling her roughly toward him. "To what charge?" Sarah demanded, planting her feet. "Articulate the exact crime I have committed." "Resisting arrest," Harrison growled, trying to force her arm behind her back. "You cannot be arrested solely for resisting arrest if there is no underlying primary charge," Sarah fired back, her legal mind operating at lightning speed despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This is an illegal arrest. You are violating my civil rights, and you are destroying your careers as we speak." Harrison and Cobb burst into hysterical laughter. The sound was ugly, echoing with deep-seated prejudice and the dangerous comfort of men who believed they were entirely untouchable. "We're terrified," Cobb wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "The criminal is lecturing us on the law. Put the cuffs on her, Greg. Let's let her sit in the back of the cruiser for a few hours. That'll cool her off." As Harrison yanked her wrists together, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting painfully into her skin, Sarah stopped resisting. She let her body go completely still. She locked eyes with Harrison, staring at him with a gaze so intensely cold and analytical that his laughter faltered for a fraction of a second. "Before you lock me in that vehicle," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "I am legally entitled to notify my legal representation. I want my phone. I want my one phone call. And I want it right now." Harrison paused, holding the locked handcuffs. He looked over at Cobb, a wicked, entertained gleam in his eye. To them, this was a game. They had absolute power, and they were thoroughly enjoying the process of breaking down a woman they deemed inferior. "You want to make a call?" Harrison mocked. "Who are you going to call? Your baby daddy? Your local drug dealer to come bail you out?" "Just give her the phone, Reg," Cobb chuckled, leaning against the hood of the Porsche. "Let's see who she cries to. Maybe it'll give us a good laugh before we haul her down to lockup." Harrison reached into Sarah's purse, pulling out her sleek, unlocked smartphone. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he held it up to her face, a cruel smirk dancing on his lips. "Since your hands are tied up, I'll dial for you." "What's the number, sweetheart?" "And put it on speaker. I want to hear this." "Dial Jonathan Miller," Sarah said, her voice perfectly even. Harrison's brow furrowed slightly. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "Jonathan Miller? That your lawyer? Or just another street thug?" "Just dial the name," Sarah commanded, her tone vibrating with an authority that finally made Harrison hesitate. Harrison tapped the screen, navigating to her contacts. He found the name Jonathan Miller and pressed the call button, making sure the speakerphone icon was illuminated. He held the phone up between them, a smug expression plastered across his face. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Looks like Johnny is asleep," Cobb taunted from the background. "Probably passed out." On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. A deep, gruff voice, thick with sleep but immediately authoritative, echoed from the phone speaker. "Miller. Jonathan." Sarah said, her voice projecting clearly into the microphone. "I apologize for waking you at this hour. It's Sarah Hastings." There was a rustling of sheets on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. The sleepiness instantly vanished from the man's voice, replaced by sharp, focused attention. "Sarah, good God, it's 1 in the morning. Is everything all right? Are you hurt?" Harrison rolled his eyes, leaning in close to the microphone. "She's doing just fine, Johnny boy," Allison interrupted, adopting a mocking, exaggerated drawl. "But she's going to be spending the night in a concrete cell. Just thought we'd let you know so you can start gathering your pennies for bail." There was a dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that precedes a massive explosion. "Who the hell is this?" Jonathan Miller's voice had dropped to a dangerous, terrifying rumble. "This is Officer Harrison, Monterey Bay PD," Harrison boasted, completely unaware of the massive trap he had just stepped into. "And my partner, Officer Cobb. We pulled over your girlfriend here in a stolen Porsche up on Ocean View Drive. She's been uncooperative, running her mouth, pretending to be some hotshot lawyer. So we're taking her in." Cobb laughed loudly in the background. "Tell him she was crying, Greg. Tell him she was begging." Another heavy silence stretched over the speaker. When Jonathan Miller finally spoke, his voice was frighteningly calm, measured with a wrath that sent an involuntary chill down Harrison's spine. "Officer Harrison, Officer Cobb," Miller said slowly, pronouncing each syllable with lethal precision. "Do you two idiots have any idea who you are speaking to?" Harrison frowned, his smugness faltering slightly. "I'm speaking to Johnny, the guy who's going to need a loan to post bail tomorrow." "You are speaking to Jonathan Miller." The voice boomed through the tiny speaker, the volume suddenly rising to a deafening roar. "The Chief of Police for the Monterey Bay Police Department. Your commanding officer." Harrison froze. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His hand holding the phone began to tremble uncontrollably. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically to Cobb, whose confident smirk had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "See, Chief," Harrison stammered, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager's. "Chief Miller?" "Sir, I didn't." "Shut your mouth, Harrison," Chief Miller roared, the sound echoing loudly in the damp night air. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Now, let me get this perfectly straight. You pulled over a 2025 Porsche Panamera on Ocean View Drive, a vehicle that I personally know is legally registered to the woman you currently have detained. Is that correct?" "Sir, she..." "The address didn't match the profile we thought." "You thought what?" Miller interrupted, his fury radiating through the phone. "You thought a black woman couldn't possibly live in that neighborhood? You profiled her. You unlawfully detained her." "Sir, she was resisting," Cobb yelled from the background, his voice panicked and desperate. "She was uncooperative. Officer Cobb, if you utter one more word, I will personally strip you of your badge tomorrow morning." Chief Miller snapped. "You are currently holding Sarah Hastings in handcuffs. Do you want to know who Sarah Hastings is, you absolute fools?" Harrison looked at Sarah. She was standing perfectly still, the cold ocean wind blowing her hair back, her expression one of ultimate, devastating triumph. "Sarah Hastings," Chief Miller continued, his voice dripping with venom, "is the chief prosecuting attorney for the state of California's Civil Rights Division. She is the woman who just finished a federal audit of our department's use of force policies. She holds the power to bankrupt this city, indict my officers, and have the Department of Justice take over our entire precinct." The phone nearly slipped from Harrison's shaking fingers. He stared at Sarah, his eyes wide with a horror so profound it bordered on comical. The woman in the oversized sweatpants wasn't a maid. She wasn't a car thief. She was the apex predator of the legal world, and they had just walked willingly into her jaws. "Harrison," Chief Miller commanded, his voice deadly quiet again, "take the handcuffs off her right now. Put her on speaker, and pray to whatever God you believe in that she doesn't press federal kidnapping charges." The sound of the handcuff key turning in the lock was deafening. It was a sharp, metallic click that echoed over the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific waves, severing the thin thread of authority Officer Gregory Harrison thought he possessed. His hand shook so violently that it took him 3 agonizing attempts to successfully insert the key. When the rigid steel cuffs finally snapped open, Sarah Hastings did not snatch her hands away. She brought her arms forward slowly, deliberately, rubbing the angry red welts forming on her wrists. She never broke eye contact with Harrison. Her gaze was not filled with rage, but with a clinical, terrifying calculation. She was looking at a man whose career was already deceased. The corpse just hadn't hit the floor yet. I am so sorry, ma'am," Harrison stammered, taking a massive step backward as if she were suddenly made of fire. The arrogant swagger had completely evaporated, replaced by the posture of a cornered, frightened animal. There was a misunderstanding. A terrible miscommunication. There was no miscommunication, Sarah stated, her voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. She held her hand out, palm up. "My phone. Now? Why—" Harrison nearly tripped over his own boots, rushing to hand the device back to her. He wiped his sweaty palm on his trousers, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Sarah took the phone, bringing it to her ear. "Chief Miller, are you still there?" "I am here, Counselor," Jonathan Miller replied. The fury in his voice had settled into a grim professional severity. "Are you unharmed? Did they use excessive force beyond the restraints?" "I have superficial bruising on my wrists from the handcuffs, and Officer Harrison subjected me to an aggressive and unconstitutional search of my person," Sarah reported clearly, knowing every word she spoke was laying the foundation for a federal indictment. "Officer Cobb illegally searched my vehicle without probable cause, consent, or a warrant. They have scattered highly sensitive, confidential state documents across the hood of their cruiser." A low, guttural sigh escaped Chief Miller over the line. "Mother of God, I am leaving my house right now. I am bringing Captain Reynolds from Internal Affairs with me. Do not let them touch your vehicle or those documents again. I am exactly 12 minutes away. Can you remain safely on the scene?" "I am perfectly safe, Chief," Sarah replied, casting a side glance at the 2 petrified officers. "These men are no longer a threat to me. They understand exactly what is about to happen." 12 minutes, Sarah. I give you my word," Miller said before the line clicked dead. Sarah lowered the phone and slid it back into the pocket of her sweatpants. She turned her attention to Officer Richard Cobb, who had retreated to the rear bumper of the Porsche. Cobb looked as though he was physically ill. His complexion was a sickly pale green under the flashing strobe of the police lights, and he was chewing frantically on his lower lip. "Counselor Hastings," Cobb started, his voice a pathetic whine, completely unrecognizable from the man who had just threatened to throw her in a concrete cell. "Please, look, Greg got carried away. I told him we shouldn't have pulled you over. I was just following his lead. I have a wife. I have 2 little girls at home. If I lose this job, you should have thought about your wife and your 2 little girls before you decided to rip a woman out of her car in the middle of the night based on the color of her skin." Sarah cut him off, her tone offering absolutely zero sympathy. "You do not get to weaponize your family to escape the consequences of your racism." "We weren't profiling," Harrison interjected desperately, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "We were just doing our jobs. This is a high-crime area for auto thefts." "We had to be sure. Do not insult my intelligence, Harrison," Sarah snapped, taking a step toward him. Harrison instinctively flinched. "You did not run my plates before initiating the stop. You did not ask for clarification on my registration. You took one look at me, looked at the neighborhood, and decided I was a criminal. You violated my 4th Amendment rights, my civil rights under Title 18 U.N.I. SCSG, sound harmed. Section 242, and you physically assaulted a federal prosecutor. Your career in law enforcement ended the moment those lights went on." The next 10 minutes were the longest of Gregory Harrison and Richard Cobb's lives. The heavy, suffocating silence of the coastal highway was broken only by the sound of the ocean and the hum of the idling Porsche. Neither officer dared to speak another word. They stood paralyzed on the damp asphalt, watching as Sarah meticulously documented the scene with her phone camera. She photographed her scattered legal documents on the hood of the cruiser. She photographed the disorganized interior of her car. She photographed the license plate of the patrol vehicle. And finally she took clear, unobstructed photos of both officers' faces and badge numbers. Every flash of her phone's camera was like a nail being driven into their professional coffins. They were trapped in a nightmare entirely of their own making, waiting for the executioner to arrive. The executioner arrived in a convoy. First came the distant wail of sirens cutting through the heavy marine layer. Then the piercing glare of LED high beams crested the hill. It wasn't just one vehicle. A black, unmarked Ford Explorer with hidden strobes flashing aggressively led the pack, followed closely by 2 standard Monterey Bay police cruisers. They swerved onto the wide shoulder of Ocean View Drive, boxing in Harrison and Cobb's patrol car completely. Before the Explorer had even fully shifted into park, the driver's side door flew open. Chief Jonathan Miller stepped out into the biting wind. He was an imposing figure, a 25-year veteran of the force, with broad shoulders and a face hardened by decades of city politics and street-level tragedies. He wasn't wearing his formal uniform. He had thrown a heavy tactical jacket over a plain t-shirt and jeans, but the gold shield on his belt commanded absolute, terrifying authority. Right behind him emerged Captain Thomas Reynolds, the dreaded head of internal affairs. Reynolds was a meticulous, humorless man who carried a heavy aluminum clipboard and wore an expression of perpetual disappointment. Chief Miller didn't look at Harrison or Cobb. He walked straight towards Sarah, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. "Sarah," Miller said, his voice dropping its authoritative boom for a moment of genuine concern. He extended a hand. "I cannot apologize enough for this. Are you injured?" Sarah shook his hand firmly. "I will need a medical evaluation for the abrasions on my wrists to add to the official report, Chief. But I am physically fine. I cannot say the same for the integrity of your night shift." Miller nodded grimly. He turned slowly on his heel, his eyes locking onto Harrison and Cobb. The 2 patrolmen snapped to a rigid position of attention, their bodies rigid with absolute terror. "Chief Miller, sir, if you'll just let me explain the procedural basis for the stop," Harrison began, his voice trembling. "Silence," Miller roared. The sheer volume of his voice echoed off the nearby cliffs. Several backup officers who had stepped out of the secondary cruisers visibly flinched. Miller closed the distance between himself and Harrison in 3 long strides, stopping mere inches from the patrolman's face. "You do not speak," Miller growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "You do not explain. You do not utter a single syllable unless Captain Reynolds explicitly demands it. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Harrison whispered, his eyes glued straight ahead, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. Miller turned to the hood of the patrol cruiser, where Sarah's confidential files were still haphazardly strewn about. He picked up a deposition transcript, reading the bold, black lettering across the top. "State Attorney General's Office, Civil Rights Division." He dropped the paper as if it were radioactive. "You pulled over the chief prosecutor of the state," Miller said, pacing slowly between the 2 officers. "You illegally detained her. You illegally searched her vehicle. And you dumped highly sensitive federal documents onto the wet hood of a police cruiser like garbage." He stopped and looked at Cobb. "What exactly were you searching for, Officer Cobb?" Cobb swallowed hard. "Sir, Officer Harrison believed. He stated he suspected the vehicle was stolen." "I did not ask what Officer Harrison believed," Miller barked. "You are an officer of the law. You have your own brain. What probable cause did you articulate before violating this woman's constitutional rights?" Cobb opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Harrison, then at the ground, utterly defeated. "None, sir. There was no probable cause. At least you have the pathetic decency to admit it. Miller sneered in disgust. He gestured sharply to Captain Reynolds. Thomas, take their hardware. Reynolds stepped forward, his face an emotionless mask. Officer Harrison, Officer Cobb, by the authority of the Chief of Police, you are both immediately suspended without pay pending a full internal and federal investigation. Hand over your service weapons, your tasers, your radios, and your badges. Now, the humiliation was absolute. Stripping an officer of their badge and gun on the side of the public highway in front of their peers was a rare and deeply shameful process. Harrison's hands shook as he unbuckled his holster, handing his block over to Reynolds. He unpinned the silver badge from his chest, his fingers lingering on the metal for a fraction of a second before surrendering it. Cobb was openly weeping silently as he handed his equipment over, the reality of his ruined life finally crashing down upon him. You are no longer police officers, Miller stated coldly, watching them stand disarmed and powerless in their own uniforms. You are currently suspects in a federal civil rights investigation. You will not return to the precinct. You will not access police databases. You will be transported to internal affairs for processing. Miller signaled to 2 officers from the backup cruisers. Put them in the back of the transport. Separate them. They do not speak to each other. As the backup officers approached to escort the disgraced men away, Sarah stepped forward. Officer Harrison, Sarah called out. Harrison paused, looking back at her. He looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant bully who had laughed at her just 30 minutes prior. You asked me earlier what kind of person I am, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the damp air. I am the person who is going to ensure you never wear a uniform, carry a weapon, or possess authority over another human being for the rest of your natural life. Have a pleasant evening. Harrison dropped his gaze to the asphalt. He was guided into the back of a police cruiser, his head pushed down to clear the door frame, the exact same humiliating treatment he had planned for Sarah. The heavy door slammed shut, locking them inside the claustrophobic cages of the vehicles they used to command. Captain Reynolds meticulously gathered Sarah's documents, placing them back into her leather briefcase with the utmost care, and handed it to her. Councillor Hastings, we will need you to come into the precinct tomorrow to give a formal, recorded statement. I'll be there at 9 a.m. Sharp, Captain, Sarah replied, taking her briefcase. And I will be bringing the State Attorney General with me. The Monterey Bay Police Department headquarters was a brutalist concrete structure built in the late 1970s, designed to project strength and immovability. By 8:45 a.m. on Wednesday morning, however, the building felt as fragile as spun glass. The news of what had transpired on Ocean View Drive had not just leaked, it had exploded across the precinct's internal communications network. Every patrolman, detective, and administrative assistant knew that officers Gregory Harrison and Richard Cobb had pulled over the wrong car, detained the wrong woman, and inadvertently invited the wrath of the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division down upon their heads. At exactly 8:55 a.m., a fleet of 3 black, government-plated Chevrolet Suburbans pulled into the reserved spaces at the front of the precinct. Sarah Hastings emerged from the lead vehicle, trading her hoodie and sweatpants for a tailored, charcoal gray Tom Ford power suit. Her demeanor was completely transformed. Gone was the weary driver simply trying to get home. In her place stood the apex predator of the California legal system. Flanking her were 4 federal investigators carrying heavy, reinforced briefcases, and leading the pack was Robert Sterling, the State Attorney General. Sterling was a towering man in his early 60s, with silver hair, a booming baritone voice, and a reputation for completely dismantling corrupt municipal departments. Chief Jonathan Miller and Mayor Thomas Jenkins were waiting in the glass-walled primary conference room on the 4th floor. The mayor, a career politician who usually thrived on media attention, looked physically ill. He was sweating through his expensive silk tie, clutching a porcelain coffee cup with trembling hands. When Sarah and Attorney General Sterling walked through the heavy oak doors, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. "Please have a seat," Mayor Jenkins offered weakly, gesturing to the sprawling mahogany table. "We prefer to stand, Thomas," Sterling replied, his voice rattling the glass walls. He did not extend a hand to shake. He slammed a thick, leather-bound folder onto the center of the table. "I'm going to save us all a tremendous amount of time. We are not here to negotiate. We are not here to discuss administrative leave. We are here to deliver the terms of your department's surrender." Chief Miller stood at parade rest, his face stoic but his eyes betraying a deep exhaustion. "The officers have been stripped of their badges and firearms, General Sterling. They are currently sequestered in holding rooms on the basement level, waiting for union representation." "Their union representation is irrelevant," Sarah spoke up, stepping forward. She unclasped her briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly bound dossiers. "Because as of 4 a.m. this morning my team obtained federal warrants and pulled the entire digital dispatch and body camera archives for the Monterey Bay Police Department. We didn't just look at Harrison and Cobb. We looked at everyone." She slid a dossier across the table toward the mayor. "Officer Gregory Harrison has 14 civilian complaints filed against him over the past 4 years. 11 of those complaints involve excessive force, unlawful detainment, and blatant racial profiling during midnight traffic stops. Officer Richard Cobb has 9 similar complaints. However, none of these complaints ever reached internal affairs." Captain Thomas Reynolds, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "That's impossible, Counselor." "But is. Every civilian complaint is routed directly through my office. Not when the precinct's union representative, Sergeant Paul Rossi, intercepts the digitized forms from the civilian portal, flags them as baseless administrative errors, and purges them from the active queue," Sarah explained, her eyes locking onto Captain Reynolds. "Rossi has been running a shadow clearinghouse for dirty cops in this precinct for half a decade. We have the IP logs, we have the deleted server cache. And as of 20 minutes ago, the FBI raided Rossi's home and took him into federal custody for obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence." Mayor Jenkins gasped, dropping his coffee cup. It shattered on the carpeted floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. The political machine he had built was collapsing before his eyes. "Harrison and Cobb weren't an anomaly, Thomas," Sterling ruled, leaning over the table. "They were the product of a toxic, protected culture. And last night they made the fatal mistake of trying to victimize the woman who wrote the book on prosecuting Title 18 U.S.C. to Rintamide. Section 242 deprivation of rights under color of law." "What are your demands?" Chief Miller asked quietly, knowing the answer was going to be devastating. "Harrison and Cobb are to be immediately terminated," Sarah stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Not suspended. Fired. We are filing federal civil rights charges against both of them before noon. Second, this department is going under a federal consent decree. The Department of Justice will oversee your hiring, firing, and training protocols for the next 10 years. Third, Mayor Jenkins, you are going to hold a press conference at 1000 p.m. today announcing your full cooperation with the DOJ, or we will indict you for complicity in Rossi's cover-up. Down in the basement holding cells, ignorant the massive legal hurricane obliterating their department above, Gregory Harrison and Richard Cobb sat in separate windowless interrogation rooms. Harrison paced back and forth, chewing his fingernails down to the quick. He was clinging to a desperate, foolish hope. He kept checking the analog clock on the wall. It was 9:30 a.m. Rossi, the union rep, should have been here by now. Rossi always fixed things. Rossi knew how to bury a bad stop. Rossi would get the body cam footage lost in the server, claim the officers acted on a good-faith anonymous tip about a stolen vehicle, and get them 2 weeks of paid vacation while the heat died down. The heavy steel door finally clicked open. Harrison stopped pacing, a relieved smile breaking across his face. But it wasn't Rossi who walked in. It was a sharp-suited young federal agent carrying a silver laptop, followed by 2 uniformed U.S. Marshals. "Officer Harrison," the agent said, sitting down at the metal table and opening his laptop. "My name is Special Agent Vance." He paused, checking his notes. "Special Agent Hayes, FBI's Civil Rights Division." "Please sit down." Harrison's stomach dropped to the floor. The air seemed to vanish from the room. "Where is Paul Rossi? I want my union representative." "I'm not saying a word until Rossi is here." Agent Hayes offered a thin, utterly devoid of warmth smile. "Sergeant Rossi is currently being processed at the Federal Detention Center in San Francisco. He's facing 30 counts of evidence tampering. The police union has officially publicly disavowed both you and Officer Cobb, citing an egregious violation of department policy that voids your legal protection clauses. You are entirely on your own." Harrison collapsed into the metal chair, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. The reality of his situation crashed into him with the force of a freight train. There was no shield, there was no blue wall of silence. There was only the blinding, unforgiving spotlight of federal justice. "Now," Agent Hayes continued, tapping a key on his laptop to begin an audio recording, "we're going to discuss the events on Ocean View Drive. And then we're going to discuss the 14 other minority drivers you terrorized over the last 4 years. I highly suggest you start talking, Gregory, because Officer Cobb is in the room next door, and whoever gives me the best timeline of your precinct's corruption gets 20 years in federal prison instead of 30. Harrison buried his face in his hands, his arrogant facade completely shattered, replaced by the pathetic echoing sound of his own weeping. 6 months later, the Philip Burton Federal Building and United States Courthouse in San Francisco was surrounded by a sea of satellite trucks, protesters, and journalists. The trial of the United States v. Gregory Harrison and Richard Cobb had become a national spectacle. It was a watershed moment in civil rights litigation, primarily because the victim was not a disenfranchised citizen without resources, but one of the most brilliant legal minds in the country. Inside Courtroom 9 on the 19th floor, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The wood-paneled walls and heavy velvet drapery gave the room an oppressive historical weight. Judge Arthur Pendleton, a no-nonsense jurist known for his severe sentencing in public corruption cases, presided over the bench. At the defense table sat Harrison and Cobb. They were completely unrecognizable from the swaggering, heavily armed men who had prowled the Pacific Coast Highway. Stripped of their uniforms and the authority they abused, they looked remarkably small. They wore cheap, ill-fitting gray suits. Their financial resources had been completely drained by legal fees and a massive civil lawsuit Sarah Hastings had filed, which successfully stripped them of their police pensions and liquidated their personal assets. Cobb had lost 20 pounds. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. Harrison sat hunched over, his shoulders rounded, unable to make eye contact with anyone in the gallery. Because Sarah Hastings was the primary victim and star witness, she could not prosecute the case herself. She had handed the reins to Assistant United States Attorney William Chen, a brilliant, aggressive litigator who possessed a photographic memory and a lethal courtroom presence. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but it was essentially over on the 4th day. The defense strategy, led by a desperate court-appointed attorney, was flimsy at best. They attempted to argue the good faith exception, claiming the officers genuinely, albeit mistakenly, believed the Porsche was stolen based on outdated dispatch data. They tried to paint the traffic stop as a routine procedure that simply escalated due to a misunderstanding. Then William Chen called Sarah Hastings to the stand. Sarah walked past the defense table without so much as a glance toward her abusers. She took the oath, sat in the witness box, and smoothed the skirt of her navy blue suit. She looked directly at the jury, projecting absolute, unwavering calm. For 4 hours, Chen walked her through the events of that night. Sarah's testimony was devastatingly clinical. She didn't use emotional hyperbole, she used precise legal terminology. She outlined exactly how the officers lacked reasonable suspicion. She detailed the physical assault during the pat-down. She explained the illegality of the vehicle search and the reckless mishandling of federal documents. But the fatal blow came during the presentation of the audio evidence. Your Honor, Trin addressed the bench. The prosecution would like to enter evidence Exhibit C, the recorded phone call made from the victim's phone to Chief Jonathan Miller, captured by the precinct's automatic incoming dispatch recording system. Judge Pendleton nodded. Proceed. Not. Chen pressed a button on his podium. The audio filled the silent courtroom, crystal clear and amplified. The jury listened as Harrison's mocking, arrogant voice echoed through the speakers. She's doing just fine, Johnny boy. But she's going to be spending the night in a concrete cell. Just thought we'd let you know so you can start gathering your pennies for bail. Then came Cobb's cruel laughter in the background. Tell him she was crying, Greg. Tell him she was begging. The reaction in the courtroom was visceral. Several jurors visibly recoiled in disgust. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The sheer, unabashed malice in the officers' voices destroyed any illusion of a good-faith mistake. It was raw, unadulterated profiling, infused with a sadistic enjoyment of power, when Chief Miller's roaring voice finally dropped the hammer on the recording, revealing Sarah's true identity. The absolute panic in Harrison's stuttering response was pathetic. Chen paused the audio. He walked slowly toward the jury box. Ladies and gentlemen, these men did not make a mistake. They made a choice. They chose to hunt. They chose to humiliate. They believed their badges granted them immunity from the Constitution of the United States. They believed the woman they pulled over was powerless. They were wrong on all counts. The defense attorney's cross-examination of Sarah was a disaster. Every attempt to rattle her was met with a devastatingly calm, legally airtight rebuttal that made the defense look completely inept. When Harrison was forced to take the stand in his own defense, Chen dismantled him in less than 20 minutes, forcing him to admit, on the record, that he never ran the Porsche's license plate before activating his emergency lights. The jury deliberated for a mere 3 hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, the silence in courtroom 9 was deafening. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.Ma. S.C. Arciscret. Section 242, we find the defendant Gregory Harrison guilty. We find the defendant Richard Cobb guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant Gregory Harrison guilty. We find the defendant Richard Cobb guilty. Harrison collapsed forward onto the defense table, burying his head in his arms, his body shaking with silent sobs. Cobb simply stared blankly at the wall, a broken man whose life was over. Judge Pendleton did not wait for a separate sentencing hearing. The disgust on his face was palpable as he looked down at the 2 disgraced officers. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a flagrant, arrogant, and vicious abuse of police power, Judge Pendleton announced, his voice ringing with righteous fury. You men are a disgrace to the uniform you wore. You shattered the public trust, and you utilized the authority granted to you by the state to operate as common thugs. The only reason this court is not reviewing a tragedy today is because you picked a victim who knew the law better than you did. Pendleton banged his gavel. Gregory Harrison, I sentence you to 108 months, 9 years in a federal penitentiary. Richard Cobb, I sentence you to 84 months, 7 years in a federal penitentiary. You will serve your sentences consecutively without the possibility of early parole. Bail is revoked. The United States Marshals will take the defendants into custody immediately. The sound of handcuffs locking around Harrison and Cobb's wrists echoed through the courtroom. It was the exact same metallic click they had forced upon Sarah 6 months prior. But this time, there was no phone call to save them. There was no corrupt union rep to delete the records. As the marshals dragged them out of the courtroom toward a future confined within concrete walls and iron bars, the absolute finality of their karma settled upon them. 2 weeks later, the fog was rolling in thick over the coast of Monterey Bay. The Pacific Coast Highway was damp, winding smoothly along the treacherous cliffs. A pristine 2025 Porsche Panamera hummed powerfully as it navigated the curves. Inside, the cabin was warm, smelling of rich leather and expensive coffee. Sarah Hastings had just left a massive restructuring meeting at the newly reformed Monterey Bay Police Department. She drove the exact speed limit, perfectly aligned within her lane. In her rearview mirror, the road behind her was completely clear. There were no flashing red and blue lights. There were no arrogant men waiting in the shadows. There was only the open road, the crashing ocean, and the quiet, unshakable peace of a woman who had faced down monsters and ensured they would never see the light of day again. The story of Sarah Hastings serves as a chilling reminder that absolute power corrupts, but undeniable knowledge prevails. Those officers believed they had trapped a helpless victim in the dark, but instead they cornered a legal titan who dragged their deep-rooted corruption into the blinding light of federal justice. Karma didn't just knock on the doors of the Monterey Bay Police Department. It kicked the hinges entirely off the frame. Sarah's terrifying ordeal and ultimate triumph proved that knowing your constitutional rights is the ultimate shield against those who seek to abuse their authority. If this story of brutal real-life justice made your blood pump, hit that like button right now. Share this video to remind everyone that absolutely nobody is above the law. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes on that dark highway? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next shocking true story.